Welcome to Final Fantasy Weekly. I'm Drew Kreisman.
And I'm Ira Kreisman.
And on this episode, we'll be discussing the gameplay, music, and artwork of Final Fantasy, or Final Fantasy I. The lead designer is Hironobu Sakaguchi. The battle system was designed by Akitoshi Kawazu. The composer was, of course, Nobuo Uematsu. And the lead, and I'm pretty sure only artist, Yoshitaka Amano. One other thing that's important to note is that Hiroyuki Ito, who would go on to be a major player in the franchise, worked as a debugger on the game. He would make his directorial debut co-directing Final Fantasy VI. So you're going to want to remember Hiroyuki Ito. Since this is our first time breaking down one of these games into its gameplay, music, and artwork, there's probably going to be a lot of just gushing initially over Nobuo Uematsu and Yoshitaka Amano in particular, talking about what we like in general, about their styles, about what they bring to the franchise, about their importance and backing up the stories written by Hironobu Sakaguchi. Of course, we'll talk specifically about a number of works from both of those artists for this specific game, but it'll be fun to set it up more generally, which we will also do with where we're going to start, which is on the gameplay, the battle system, the thing that a lot of people think is the most important part, no matter how story-driven your game may be. Is it fun to play? So let me start with that. The most broadest question I can ask, the most broad question
I wasn't going to point it out.
The most broad question that I can ask about the game, which is Final Fantasy fun to play?
Yes. I'm going to go with yes on this one. I'm pretty sure I'm right. I will give you a couple reasons why I think I'm right. I think that the continual rewarding system of leveling up, which you can see in other games like Dragon Quest, D&D, and so on, but it's particularly rewarding to constantly see your characters grow, especially that halfway point where Bahamut gives you the class upgrades is particularly satisfying. Being able to engage with an interesting story and an interesting world. There are a couple things, though, that I found on my original playthrough back in the early 90s frustrating. First was frickin' War Mech. Did I mention that last time?
Yeah,
War Mech?
War Mech.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we got you.
So there are a couple things that I found particularly difficult and frustrating my first playthrough, and I didn't even realize that they probably shouldn't be that way. I just learned how to deal with them. The first one is targeting, and the second one is spell charges. So in the original Final Fantasy game, there's no active time battle. If you've never played this game, but you've played other Final Fantasies, you're used to your character's active time battle gauge increasing, and once it's all the way full, you get to choose what that character does. They do it. The monsters will act when they're ready, and your other characters, all your characters will act when their ATB fills up. In Final Fantasy, you choose what all your characters do, and then they do it, and the monsters do their things depending on their speed. So if you've got a particularly slow character, they might always go last. If you've got a particularly fast character, they might always go first. But usually it's mixed up every time, so you don't know who's going to do what when. This is important in the first Final Fantasy because if you target a monster and you kill that monster with your first dude, but you were really scared of that monster and targeted him with all your dudes, all those dudes are going to beat that dead monster to death. Even more death, not to like lich death, but death, like smear on the ground death. And it's annoying. It's freaking annoying. If I was so scared of that giant ogre, and there were two giant ogres, and I was focusing on the one because I wanted to make sure that I killed one, and my warrior hit it and it killed it, and then my black mage fired its fire at it, and it had no effect because it was striking that empty area. This was a thing that would be changed in later games, and when they did the remakes, the Dawn of Souls remake I'm most familiar with, that was fixed so that your character would automatically target a living enemy.
Yeah, I think ultimately that was and that was the right way to go, though I think there may have been a way to have it possible for you to attack empty space if you weren't paying close attention. There's an argument, I think, to be had that it actually increases the amount of forward thinking you have to do, and certainly it's a risk-taking thing. do you want to risk attacking empty space, or is it more important to you that you for sure take out that monster on this turn because you can't withstand another barrage of attacks next turn? So there is a strategic element to it.
Yeah, and I definitely learned that I had to split up my attacks. My warrior and would not attack the same monster as my thief. And then I would have maybe my red mage and my thief attack the same guy, and my warrior attack a different guy, and have the white mage do some sort of a support spell, so just to try to make sure that I didn't waste any attacking opportunities. But still, it was annoying.
It was, yeah, and especially for me because I know I'd played later games in the series first, so going back to that seemed even especially primitive. You're just like, wait, what? How is that? Why? Why would you even allow that to be possible? I'm attacking empty space. Nobody in an actual battle. And this has been a critique of all the Final Fantasy battle systems, even down to the way they're presented, with it being this weird thing where everyone's stopped, right? And it happens one thing at a time, and people who aren't used to it, it can be very counterintuitive. So that's even an extra level of it. Nobody in any real fight would ever just attack completely empty space. Come on.
Sure, maybe, probably.
Probably.
Not
having never been in an
actual fight.
Yeah.
Except
certainly
with you.
We've never battled goblins, though. Never goblins.
No, but little brothers, though.
Sure. And then you mentioned the spell charges, a really weird system that they would never use again. That, again, I'm not 100% sure has no merit. I think it presents an interesting set of challenges, but I think the systems they came up with later on were clearly all better.
I definitely prefer the magic point system. Having spell charges, that is, having your character only be able to cast, for example, 5 first-level spells before they have to rest, is annoying. That said, that is a system from D&D. It comes right from Dungeons & Dragons. I have been playing with the same friends. I've been playing D&D with the same friends since late high school, and I still find that system of having to have my spellcasters memorize their spells before they go to sleep and only having a certain number of charges irritating. I still would prefer magic points, but some of my friends are a little more old school in that way.
Yeah.
And we do a point system for other characters and other environments. So we do it both ways, but it is a thing in other games too, and it's just a thing I prefer magic points. I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I do too, and I think it just intuitively works, and it also gives you another part of your character. Like you said, one of the cool things about these games, whatever system you're using, is always character progression and your ability to get better at doing different things, and so having magic points is another area where you can increase both how often you can use magic by getting more and more magic points as you level up, and in addition to how powerful your magic is. There's just another element there of character progression that would take some interesting turns throughout the franchise and how you level up your magic and level up your characters, and we'll talk about all those, of course, but pretty standard leveling system in the first game. I would imagine, without really knowing, but taken mostly from the Dungeons and Dragons tradition of just kind of slowly but surely accruing, especially back then, a small number of experience points for each one battle, and the characters just slowly automatically progressing. Yeah,
I'm pretty sure that is taken directly from D&D. In Dungeons & Dragons, generally 20th level is the highest level. I do not recall in the original Final Fantasy game, was it 99, or was that not something that happened till later?
Not sure.
I'll bet somebody knows, and if anybody's listening who does know, feel free to let us hear it.
Yeah. Little audience participation, that is. What all of these things amount to, I think, ultimately, is that a game that is much harder than a lot of the games that would come after it. It's pretty punishing, whether it's not having enough spell charges to get through an entire dungeon, or having one targeting mistake at the end of a dungeon cost you and you have to go all the way back. And one of the things that always stuck out to me that I remembered was this was before there were save points. And in fact, you had to, again, buy items like getting spell charges. You had to spend your money, which was few and far between, to get houses, but I think they might have been renamed tents because tents was later more of a thing. But whatever it was, that was the only way to save the game. And so even your ability to not lose a bunch of your real world time, if you played for an hour and then got beat by an enemy, that hour of progress was just gone. And so you really had to be strategic about where you placed your save points. And it's funny because a lot of old school video games were difficult because of the limited capacity of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and so it's like you can only design a certain amount of levels. But the Final Fantasy still would have been a long adventure without being punishingly difficult. And I think that's one of the things that they learned quickly. And I know there are people who, there are definitely two sides of this argument. Is it better if your Final Fantasy game is challenging, or is it better if it's open for anyone to pretty much play as long as you use some basic logic and be able to get through the game? I tend to be more in that latter category. I like it to be fun to play, but if it's too challenging, you're putting a barrier between your audience and getting to experience your story and the other stuff we're going to talk about in this one here with the music and the artwork and all that good stuff.
Sure, if what your audience associates with your game is really, really wanting to just snap their controller in half, well, you might have gone a little too far.
Right, yeah.
So there's a balance to be found there. One of the other things I wanted to mention with regards to gameplay is, and this is also something that does show up in D&D, is elemental weaknesses. Long before Pokemon would appear, though perhaps not to the same extent as Pokemon, there were you could deal extra damage to certain character or certain monsters depending on what sort of elemental magic you might use against them, or if you had a weapon that was affiliated with a particular element. For example, fighting water creatures, if you did electrical damage to them, you could deal extra damage. Usually this would be in the form of a black spell, lightning, or bolt, depending on your version. Same with, the fire monsters, you could use your ice spells. The ice monsters, you could use your fire spells and deal more damage to them. That is something that has held throughout, though which elements do extra damage to which monsters is sometimes mixed up a little depending on the game. It's always been something that I've really liked. I always thought that should carry over to all games. So if you're playing Street Fighter, different example, if you're playing Mortal Kombat and you use a fire attack against Sub-Zero, that should do extra damage to Sub-Zero.
Yeah.
And maybe it does, I don't know, but it's certainly a sensibility that I think makes a lot of sense, and so I was thrilled when Pokemon did it to such a great degree, though I do have an issue with some of their types. But nevertheless, I think it's a cool system, and I like it when games use it well.
Yeah, I agree, and that reminds me of one of the other things that I really liked about it was driving home right away the importance of the different classes, making them really feel like they're doing different jobs. That would be another name they would be sometimes known by, jobs or classes, but feeling like they're different units in a battle, like you would feel whether it's a Dungeons and Dragons party adventure, it's done in Lord of the Rings with, they've all got their different strengths and weaknesses. And in particular, I remember, because of the stuff we were talking about with the spell charges and the way all of that worked, if you chose a black mage, and I always wanted to have a black mage in my party because I was drawn to the design, and that clearly was the right artistic pull, because we'll talk about the design of that character in a minute, but it was almost a useless character most of the time because you didn't want to use one of your magic charges in a battle against a random goblin or most of the random encounters that you would have in those games. But then when you did get to the boss, the big baddie at the end of the dungeon, your black mage suddenly became by far the most powerful member of your team. And what it always reminded me of was like siege weapons or something like that, something that would be useful or useless in a random skirmish, something that would need to be protected in most random battles. But then when it's time to sack the city, that's when you need it the most. And so I loved that just basic concept that you could be useless much of the time, but the most important member at the most important times. That's a pretty cool type of balancing act you've got to do if you want to take a character like that. I think it also separated Final Fantasy early as a franchise that was really about teamwork and people having to rely on each other and teamness and plurality, where most other games, certainly at the time and since, and a lot of other stories are focused on individuals and individualism.
One of the things added to the Dawn of Souls version of Final Fantasies 1 and 2 are special dungeons. In Final Fantasy 1, there are 4 special dungeons, one for each of the 4 elements of the game. The Earth Gift Shrine, the Hellfire Chasm, the Life Spring Grotto, and the Whisperwind Cove. And what's particularly fun about these dungeons, aside from being able to get some cool new items that make your characters even more stronger than they already are, even more stronger, is that each of these dungeons has 4 bosses, and the 4 bosses come from later games. So the Earth Gift Shrine has the 2-headed dragon, the Aramen, Cerberus, and Echidna, all from Final Fantasy III. The Hellfire Chasm has the 4 fiends from Final Fantasy IV, Scarmiglione, Cagnazzo, Barbarica, and Rubricant. And I love Rubricant. Rubricant is a really cool character.
Yeah.
Dare I say, one of my favorite characters. And I won't say that often. The Lifespring Grotto has Gilgamesh, another awesome mainstay of the Final Fantasy series, Atomos, Shinryu, and Omega. And Whisperwind Cove has Typhon, Orthos, otherwise known as Ultros, the Phantom Train, and Deathgaze from Final Fantasy VI. So we have talked a lot about versions, and depending on the version you have, the name might be this or that, or the translation might be a little goofy. But when we talk about storytelling, when we talk about the oral tradition, stories often change depending on who's telling them, when they're telling them, who they're telling them to, who they learn the story from. So I have always found it interesting that when the Final Fantasy series, well, and other games also, when they get remakes, sometimes there will be additions, sometimes there will be a little more, sometimes things will have changed a little bit. And I really like that. I really like seeing that in this version of things, well, maybe it happened a little differently. Or in this version of things, maybe because of perspective, something looks a little different. Or maybe because of the time loop, the caves didn't exist last time. Who knows? But I really like that every once in a while you might put a different spin on things because we have a different perspective. And I think these dungeons are a lot of fun, and the haters can hate all they want.
I agree. That's a good note to wrap that segment up on. So let's talk a little. Well, actually, let's talk a lot of music. We're going to talk about some of the specific tracks. I want to get into that, but let us first give praise be to Yevon. Except in this case,
yes.
Praise be to Nobuo Uematsu. Nobuo Uematsu has been a major influence on my personal musical style. His melodies, in particular, is something he's obviously known for. But he has had pretty easily the greatest career of any composer in video game history. There are certainly other people who've had wonderful careers. Koji Kondo comes to mind, did most of the famous Nintendo themes that you can think of, the Mario theme, the Zelda stuff. He's had a fantastic career, but you're really not going to find a consensus, any kind of objective publication anywhere in the world that's going to make an argument against Nobuo Uematsu as the greatest video game composer of all time. His body of work is just patently absurd. I think, quite frankly, it stands up there. You've got to start talking about people like John Williams as contemporaries for who actually he's in the category of. You've got to get outside of the video game world. He's just that good. Ira? Thoughts?
Yes,
Thoughts?
I agree. Yeah, not being a musician, he certainly hasn't influenced me in the way he has influenced you. That said, just as like you were saying, a creative body of work, it's really darn impressive, and it does influence me in a lot of ways. Sometimes I listen to the originals when I'm at work or when I'm trying to be a writer. I will listen to orchestral variations. I will listen to the Black Mages, his rock band, and their variations. You mentioned John Williams. I would also liken him to Joe Hisashi, who has scored the Studio Ghibli films.
Yeah.
Mr. Hisashi does not have the same volume of work, I don't think, but it is of the same caliber or of a comparable caliber. Just beautiful on so many levels and so fitting to whatever it is he is scoring. And that, I think, is particularly impressive given how many different types of worlds and characters and events he has had to score.
Right. And that's the thing, coming back to with Uematsu, is just that there are so many characters, and you can talk about some of the most indelible things about the series being how many memorable characters have come out of the Final Fantasy franchise, and they've all got pieces of music that embody who they are, most of them unforgettable. You can't separate Aerith, or Aerith, we'll have that conversation, I'm sure, but you cannot separate her from her theme. You cannot separate Terra, or even the game Final Fantasy VI, from her theme. You can't separate the franchise from the prelude or the main theme, the first two of the first couple of pieces of music you hear in this game. So it's just like, he's as important a creative member of why this stuff has been popular and been successful, I think, as much as Hironobu Sakaguchi. I mean, if the stories weren't there, it'd be pretty music backing up nothing. But, I mean, it just doesn't work that way. And throw Amano in there. But usually the way scoring works is it's the last thing that's done on any project. And a lot of times, early tracks have to be done when a composer's just looking at a sketch. So Yoshitaka Amano designs a character, hands that to Nobuo Uematsu, who comes up with a melody just based on who he thinks this person is. And the number of times he's been able to do that, whether it be the most evil of villains to the most conflicted of villains, to the most heroic of heroes, or sympathetic of tragic losses, to battling gods in outer space. It's just, what has he not scored? What kind of person or world or scenario has he not been asked to come up with a piece of music for? And he has succeeded every single time.
Furthermore, no shade to Mr. Sakaguchi or Mr. Amano, but there are showcases specifically for the music of Final Fantasy. In fact, if I recall correctly, a few episodes ago you mentioned you went to one such showcase.
Indeed, a sold-out show on the campus of the University of Denver, Distant Worlds. This is music from Final Fantasy pared down to a very simple ensemble. There was only one repetition of instruments. There were 2 violins. Other than that, only one instrument apiece. There was one horn player. He would go back and forth between trumpets and cornets, and I think he might have played a French horn in one song. There was one flautist, there was one cello, there was one guy on the piano, there was one percussionist, and that was pretty much the ensemble. So it was a stripped down version. It was conducted by, I can't remember the guy's name, I'll have to look it up and put it in the notes for this, but Arnie Roth is his father, and Arnie Roth is the conductor for the orchestras for the original Voices and Distant Worlds projects and all of those kinds of things. So this is like a second-generation conductor and a third-generation ensemble that are doing smaller pieces that oftentimes don't get played by the big orchestras when they go and tour. I've seen the Colorado Symphony Orchestra present Nobuo Uematsu with their full choir. That was a sold-out show. They've sold out the Hollywood Bowl, 10,000 people for, as you mentioned, the Black Mages. So, yeah, these showcases, and they're playing songs from 30 years ago that they didn't manage to get the last 10 times they went on tour. They're still finding melodies of Uematsu's that have been underrated or have been, maybe haven't gotten to get out of their 8-bit chiptune sounding ways yet, but still recognizing the classics of his melodies and counter melodies and all the things that he's really, really good at, and presenting it on stage to this day, 30 years later.
So shall we talk about some of those melodies in particular?
We shall. Let's first mention a couple that we're not going to play, starting with, well, one we do play at the beginning and end of every episode. Of course, you can't not do it. It's the prelude. It's everything that Final Fantasy is. It's simple, but complicated. It's all it is it's an arpeggio, but it loops back in on itself, much like a 2,000-year time loop, if you will. It loops in a way that that makes you only slightly uncomfortable because it's chromatic. It doesn't stay on the exact same scale the whole time. It changes scales, but it never gets any blue tones. It doesn't go outside. Each time it changes its scale, it, for that arpeggio, stays inside of the scale. So essentially, you've got the perfect, nice little sounding. The first thing that they teach you in music, play a little scale up and down those notes. That's just automatically comforting. It's as simple and comforting as a piece of music can sound, up and down the scales. The first thing they teach you when you learn an instrument. And then all he's done is take that and start arranging it and looping it in such a way that it creates this unforgettable, like we've talked about, the theme of the series. It's familiar and it's foreign at the exact same time. It's brilliant piece of work. And of course it would be in all of the games throughout the franchise, and he would go on to add things to it over the years, and those would get really interesting too. It become a much bigger piece. But in the original game, all it was the arpeggio that loops on itself. I think every 4, or maybe it's even like a weird number, maybe it's like every 5 measures it loops, which also makes it a little bit strange. And then the other piece that we have played, that we've talked about, that is in every Final Fantasy game, it's the opening theme. In this one, it plays during the flash card, or the title card at the very beginning, and it's in the credits of every single game. It's an indelible Final Fantasy thing. That's one of my favorite words, apparently. I'm going with indelible these days, but it really is.
Nicely done.
Anyone who, if they ever said, yeah, I'm a Final Fantasy fan, could sing or hum to you the main Final Fantasy theme on cue, no problem, all the way through. Yeah, so do you have anything to add on those 2 particular pieces of music?
Not so much on the prelude. I think you did a nice job with the technical bit there. One of the things about the opening theme that so enamors me is it reminds me of other themes like that. Like you said, if you talk to a Final Fantasy fan and you mention the opening theme, they could hum it. Same with if you asked a Star Wars fan what the opening theme of Star Wars is, or Star Trek for that matter. These are arcing stories that have encapsulated themselves in a particular theme, and that's hard to do. You will hear, you will see shows and movies that have theme songs or have songs that try to capture it in some way. Some of them do a great job. Very few of them succeed as strongly as the Final Fantasy opening theme and prelude. I would say Star Wars does, Star Trek does, Indiana Jones probably.
Yeah.
But there aren't a lot.
Yeah, I think that's a good list. I think one of the other things that's really interesting about that theme is that there are several others throughout the franchise that are kind of in its vein. And it has this combination of cultures. It's very European sounding. In fact, it's pretty French in its execution. And it's something that we would see repeated again in Final Fantasy II, one of my favorite themes, being the Rebel Army theme. It's something that would be common in a lot of Final Fantasy IX's music, which of course is largely a callback to the early games. And even in this one, Matoya's Cave, another song that we did play in the first episode, or I should say in the last episode, so we won't do it here, but another one that is built on a very similar sort of regal structure. It's built up to be a kind of empowering. You could see it as a sort of march through the streets, and it's also march built. That's something you'll see a lot of times. A lot of the main themes in Final Fantasy games either are explicitly marches, like Terra's in Final Fantasy VI. It just begins like there's a march while the credits are rolling.
They literally march, yes.
There's a snare drum in the background, but and that's a good way to test, is this or is this not a march? Just in your mind, put a military snare drum in the background. And a lot of these songs, including the opening theme from the very first game and a lot of the main themes, you could just put that snare behind it. Matoya's Cave is another one. Certainly the Rebel Army from Final Fantasy II, I think in most iterations it does have the snare drum behind it. So marches, because there's almost always that kind of forward momentum, especially at the beginning of a Final Fantasy game. Another thing that's almost always at the beginning of a Final Fantasy game, where do you go? What's the first thing you do? You go to town. So let's play our first one here, our first little interjection. Actually, I'm going to do two in a row because they're different themes, but they're both immediately recognizable. Again, if you played this, I think if you played either of these themes to somebody who's even loosely familiar with Final Fantasy, they would go, is that Final Fantasy music? I think they would know that right away. So I'm going to play back-to-back little snippets from Corneria Castle and the song simply titled Town. Alright, so what you've got here is essentially Uematsu carving out a specific thing that somehow he would nail over and over and over again, which is this setting of the town, the small place, the normal people, the place where you talk to the NPCs, the beginning of the journey. Sometimes they're even in the middle of the journey. One of, I think, both of our favorites, which has a hilariously mistranslated name that sometimes they fix. I prefer when they don't. I prefer when they leave it in the I, Garland, will knock you all down category, is from Final Fantasy VI, Kids Run Through the City Corner.
You know, on the one hand, I do like a certain self-awareness about which mistranslations work or have become famous enough to allow to work. However, Kids Run Through the City Corner is a bit gruesome.
It's a little violent, yeah.
Unless the corner is like, you know, the square or the plaza or something.
Right.
But yeah, I think we can call that one Kids Run Through the City, and it is as evocative and tone-setting as the music itself. And this particular town music, as you just played for us, fits the same role, would you not say?
Absolutely. I think it's this kind of interesting balance that he strikes, because there is a melancholy tone to it while still being mostly uplifting. Kids Run Through the City being more obviously, I think, melancholy because that world just kind of is in that place, and we're still learning about, especially Corneria. Man, when I booted up the world of Final Fantasy a couple months ago for the first time and started playing that, when you get to the Corneria Castle at the very beginning and they started playing the music, like, it was one of those things that it just hits you. It feels so Final Fantasy, and it feels so Uematsu. And I think part of the reason why it's emotional, not just the nostalgia, is because he knows how to put just a hint of, this is a place with a princess who's been kidnapped and their knight has gone rogue and trying to knock people all down and those kinds of things. So I think it's something that he really manages to strike a nice balance between the uplifting, adventurous opening theme, the main theme, which is one of my favorites from the series. So I'll put a little clip of that in right here. That's one that's still being played to this day. Again, something that if you played that to somebody, they go, oh, that sounds like those Final Fantasy games. It's still good. I think the first one is one of the best main world, overworld themes that Uematsu ever came up with. Again, carving out this specific area of, I'm good at setting the stage of just a place. It just feels good to be in a place. So we were talking earlier about his ability to see a character or understand an event and write to that. But being able to write to a place, much like Howard Shore did The Shire, I think beautifully. It's that place is almost inseparable from its music, like we were talking about with the characters. You think of the Shire, you think of that theme. You think of Corneria, you think of the theme. You think of the very first time you saw an overworld map, and this song that we just played will pop into your head.
I feel like I'm a little underqualified to talk about Uematsu's music, except to say that I love it. But I do think that I feel comfortable saying that one of the things that sets video games apart as a piece of art or as an artistic medium is that it can, when it does it well, combine the graphic arts and the musical arts and the storytelling arts. And that's not something you really see anywhere else except in movies. But then video games have the advantage of putting you in control, as we talked about, as we use the metaphor of the hand of fate on the controller an episode or two ago.
I'll give you an example of how that's impacted even in the music. The very first time, specific memory in my mind, I'm jumping ahead several games, but that's what these episodes are good for a little bit. The very first time we walked into that bar, I believe in South Figaro in Final Fantasy VI, and Shadow's music started playing instead of the normal town music. You stop. In a movie, you can't stop. The song plays for however long it plays for. But knowing that the tone had shifted, we, as the controller of how the story would progress, decided to slow it down because of the interesting musical direction, editing choices, and just the quality of that track. And another one of the early ones for me like that, because again it was a shift in tone from Final Fantasy I, is in the Chaos Temple or the Chaos Shrine, one of the first dungeons. It's not the first actual dungeon that you really go to and then you come back to it later. It's a shift in tone. It's a much darker sounding thing than anything that we've heard so far from Uematsu. Now, we're nowhere close to him doing Libere Fatale or One-Winged Angel or anything on the level of that dark and foreboding, but this was probably the earliest example that he had a little bit of that menacing tone. And the other thing it is, and I don't think it gets enough credit for this, is it's his first use of leitmotif, because later on you would go to the Shrine Temple, and though it's not exactly the same, they have very, very similar recurring themes. Listen to the two of those back to back. So, yeah, good moody stuff there from Uematsu. And of course, we can't finish this up without talking about two more pieces of music that would become absolutely synonymous with the series, that would be used over and over and over again. Well, 2.5 really, because, and this is something I love, the battle theme. Let's talk about that first, because the battle theme starts as all battle themes would start for the next 9 entries in the game, giving us what? The familiar, the comfortable, something that keeps all of the games clearly a part of the same franchise. Every time you get into a battle, which is a lot in Final Fantasy, it is after all about adventuring through dangerous territory much of the time, you will hear the exact same bass line. And then they'll build something else, something different, and by they, of course, I mean Nobuo Uematsu. Hopefully you haven't gotten tired of the love we're giving to Nobuo Uematsu, and it's not going to end anytime soon, but building something different over the top of that same basic thing. Again, Final Fantasy combining something totally familiar, comfortable, give me the same thing every single time, except it's also different every single time. And finally, something that I think, again, is something that even people who, if it might be the only thing they know about Final Fantasy, it might be something that people even know the sound, and it's perhaps the most perfect sound in the franchise to stand for exactly what it's supposed to stand for. Again, Uematsu completely nailing the feeling, and that, of course, is the victory fanfare. When you win a fight... Victory fanfare. Again, people who don't know Final Fantasy know that short little collection of notes. Anybody can go ba 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 ba, and it sounds like exactly what it is. It's people being happy that they just won.
I have a quick story about the victory fanfare. For several years, I was a speech and debate coach. Speech and debate is a set of events involving speaking and debating. And one of the speaking events, are you familiar with it, Mr. Kreisman?
I believe I may be, yeah.
So the speaking events include what are called interpretive events. You can do a drama interpretation or a comedy interpretation or a poetic interpretation. Easy for me to say. And I once judged a round where one of the comedy interps included the victory fanfare from Final Fantasy. And my guess is I was the first judge to write on his ballot Final Fantasy Victory Fair with an exclamation point, possibly two, underlined a couple times. And I'm pretty sure that kid went first in the round. I'm not saying it was because of the Final Fantasy Victory Fanfare, but it may well have been.
You could play those collection of notes like if you just won money by playing the slot machines. Right.
Isn't there you are familiar with the professional wrestling world, is that correct?
Indeed.
Isn't there a pro wrestler who will occasionally play Final Fantasy Victory Fanfare?
He's done it a couple times before, yeah. His name is Xavier Woods. It's not, it's obviously his wrestling name. And he has a video game channel called Up, Up, Down, Down. And
nice, good for him.
And he plays a trombone when he comes out to the ring, and he plays all kinds of fun stuff. But yeah, he's definitely played the Final Fantasy Victory Fanfare before. I think he's said publicly that Final Fantasy VII is his favorite video game of all time. Honestly, if I had a dream guest to have on this podcast, not that I think we'll ever be able to have guests, but it would be Xavier Woods. Talking to Sakaguchi-san or Uematsu-san, it's like that'd be awesome, but there'd be translation stuff. There's all kinds of, that seems really unlikely. Any of that stuff, of course, those would be dream guests. But just talking to somebody who I think is an interesting person who's a fan of this stuff as much as we are and appreciates it on the artistic level, it'd be Xavier Woods. And yeah, he played the fanfare on the trombone. He had a chocobo at one point, a stuffed chocobo attached to his trombone at some point for some reason, just going out there on TV acting a fool.
Good for him. Yeah. So that shows that the music and this particular thread,
element,
this particular musical element, having gained. Final Fantasy is, of course, very popular, but it's less popular in the U.S. than it is in, for example, Japan. So that somebody with such a platform decided, you know what I'm going to do? During a pro wrestling match, or at the end of a pro wrestling match, I'm going to play the Final Fantasy Victory Fanfare on my trombone. Speaks, I think, to the strength of this particular riff.
On that note, we thought this would be a good time to just go ahead and do a list. And this is by no means a comprehensive list, but briefly as we can, we're going to list out our favorites. These really are just our favorites of the official rearrangements of Uematsu's music and some of the unofficial rearrangements of Nobuo Uematsu's music, beginning with the ones that he himself appears in, the Voices, the Distant Worlds concerts, the New Worlds concerts, which are just direct arrangements of his music that usually he himself shows up at, which is nice. And then he, of course, has to show up at the Black Mages, as you mentioned, because he's in that band.
He is definitely in that band. He plays an instrument and everything.
So, and they do. It's one of the things that I think put some of the unofficial remixers, like there's a lot of great metal people. None of them are on my list, guys who do metal remixes of Uematsu stuff, because it's just usually not as good as the Black Mages.
The Black Mages are pretty tops.
Yeah. Then you've got then you've got yourself a list of official albums that came out that were at the times when we were just getting BitTune stuff early on. But you've got Prey, Celtic Moon, Grand Finale, and then pretty much every game has its own piano collection. So you've got, if you want to say, on quote, real instruments and orchestral rearrangements of his music.
It was certainly something that you didn't see much of at the time because it just was not something that they did. You didn't get CDs of video game music. You just listened to it when you played the game. So it certainly seemed revolutionary to me at the time, buying CDs.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, CDs, and it was a brand new technology. I still remember the first CD we went out and got. It's Bob Marley, Talkin' Blues.
Still have that CD.
Yeah. And then you start getting into people who are outside of the actual framework, who weren't officially working with Uematsu, but I still think count as official people. The Video Games Live guys do a great job. They've got their official concert. They, of course, do a bunch of non-Final Fantasy stuff. In fact, the creator even talked about how he thought there should be, as you were just talking about, symphonic music for all of the other games as well. So he wanted to focus specifically not on Final Fantasy, but even he couldn't keep Final Fantasy rearrangements out.
I would think it would be hard, yeah.
Then you've got the Swedish Radio Symphony Orchestra. They do by far my favorite version of the opera, and that's difficult to accomplish because there are a lot of great versions of that from Final Fantasy VI, obviously. And Roger Wanamo's rearrangement of all of the music from Final Fantasy VI. He also does one from Final Fantasy VIII I can't remember the title of, but the one from VI called Born with the Gift of Magic is absolutely superb. And he's a world-renowned composer.
Another official arrangement I really like are the Potion CDs. The first one was blue. The second one was orange. I think it was just Potion 1 and Potion 2.
Yeah.
They do really pretty piano music and lighter arrangements of various Final Fantasy tracks.
Some people would call that study music. There are a lot of those remixes of Final Fantasy study music. Then we've got our list of our favorite remixers, rearrangers, and really most of them have posted at one point or another on OC Remix.
Good old OC Remix, yeah.
You can't do much better than those guys do. There are a lot of people out there. And then, of course, some of the stuff that's been loosely associated with them, KFSS Studios,
right.
Project Majestic Mix.
Yeah, they did Project Majestic Mix. Well before Kickstarter, they did crowdfunding for a tribute to Nobuo Uematsu, Project Majestic Mix. And there was the gold album and the silver album. And I have both. Yeah, that's one of those things I should take pictures of and put up on the tweeters.
Yeah. But then, of course, just a part of the huge community of people who they're doing all kinds of video game music out there now, but by far leading the pack. You go and look at the statistics. It's Final Fantasy stuff by far. Then we've got the brave new world of YouTube, another place where you can find endless. Look, this is a small list of people who are on YouTube producing remarkable quality Final Fantasy rearrangements. But I want to start with two that a lot of people probably know. The first being Lindsay Sterling.
Yeah, she's gained a lot of internet acclaim in the last couple of years.
So. I think she first showed up kind of on the national scale on one of those, so you think you've got talent, or
Simon Cowell was mean to her on one of those. Told
her that it was silly. She was a street performer. Because she would dance and play the violin at the same time. She's really incredible. Has a lot of good original stuff. She's worked with Imagine Dragons and stuff. But she has an arrangement of all of the heroine music, all of the female heroes from Final Fantasy that's really fantastic. And it just, I think, is her and the next one on the list, Tina Guo, who a lot of people don't know is responsible for Wonder Woman's theme, and she plays Wonder Woman's theme on an electric cello, and it was written by someone else but based on her style.
Okay.
And she does a lot of what we would again loosely call nerd stuff as well. And so, of course, she's got a Final Fantasy arrangement from Final Fantasy VII. And I think the reason those two kind of go together is it shows Lindsay Sterling has also done Zelda and Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Final Fantasy fits in that category. If you know those things and you're a musician, you're going to be aware of this stuff. And another one that kind of falls in that category, I think, is the Grassini Project, who they also do. One of my favorite things they do, actually, is a rearrangement of a Game of Thrones song called The Reigns of Castamere. It is gorgeous. Look it up. But they also do the most recent, the Final Fantasy 15 vocal stuff.
Nice.
Yeah, they are extraordinarily talented. Another group on the list here, Moonbow Music Movie. They're my new favorite ones. It's a group of Japanese people, I believe. I really don't know, but they've put together this group that does different rearrangements of all kinds of Final Fantasy stuff and the Chrono stuff, which again is something you see goes together a lot.
They generally pair well.
Then somebody who I was actually just showing Ira, another one of my new favorites is Mark Papagen. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly.
That sounds like sort of how it's spelled.
Yeah, but he is a multi-instrumentalist who has taken it upon himself to create medleys for most of the games. I don't know which ones for sure. I don't know which ones he doesn't. I know he does 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And
sure. I imagine he's got a list of things to do.
Yeah. But he plays all the different instruments, and I think he does a really good job of arranging them and such that the music reminds you of all of the experiences of having played the game, which is pretty cool. And then Sebastian Frege, I'm going with. What do you think?
I would say Frege, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not a Nordic language expert.
Who does cello rearrangements and puts them on a loop and makes them. It's just another way of reinterpreting and understanding this music, and I think it just goes to show how malleable his melodies are. Daisuke Minamizawa? Minamizawa?
You're the one who studied Japanese.
Yeah,
you're looking at me.
I'm going with, but he's my favorite acoustic rearranger on YouTube. Just plays stuff on the acoustic guitar, really quality stuff from him. Super Guitar Bros, if you want two of them. They do lots of video game stuff. I think they're more known for their Castlevania stuff. You can't go wrong with that. And somebody most people probably know by now, but he's awesome.
The guy with the beard and the cat.
The guy with the beard and the cat. Smooth McGroove, a cappella rearrangements of all kinds of stuff. Most famously, I think his Street Fighter II Guile's theme.
That is a pretty good one.
But he does all kinds of Final Fantasy stuff, which again, I think the overarching theme here is that if you're into video game music at all, Final Fantasy is practically unavoidable. And if you're into nerd culture at all, or things that loosely fit in that category, whether it be Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, or, Pokemon or Game of Thrones, all this stuff, the people who are out there and extraordinarily talented, putting their talents toward reinterpreting it, they've got their Final Fantasy song that they do. At least one out there. And I think you're right that the music probably has more crossover appeal than any other aspect of these games. That being said, there is no shortage of fan art or collections, or even just appreciations of Amano's work. We got to move to the next guy, Yoshitaka Amano. And of course, Amano has achieved success even outside of the Final Fantasy world. That's something that some of these other guys have failed to do. Uematsu's music outside the Final Fantasy world hasn't been as successful. Sakaguchi's Mistwalker production really did not go well. But Yoshitaka Amano, in addition to being the Final Fantasy guy for at least the first 6, and obviously still a huge part of it after that, when the sometimes hated and often beloved Tetsuya Nomura would take over for a large part.
That'll be another good conversation.
Yeah. But Yoshitaka Amano had success with Vampire Hunter D, an incredibly popular anime project, and has had a number of galleries and is incredibly successful, especially in Japan, even with stuff that's not Final Fantasy related, and maybe most famously with Neil Gaiman at the beginning of the Sandman project, doing what I think some people consider the best graphic novel of all time, if not Watchmen.
Yeah, I was going to say Watchmen's going to be high on that list too. Dark Knight probably. I think All-Star Superman is up there. But regardless, Sandman is an incredible book. Yoshitaka Amano's art combined with Neil Gaiman's storytelling is phenomenal, to say the least. Neil Gaiman's had a pretty good run lately of having his stuff turned into TV shows. American Gods is on now, and Good Omens is going to get a run with David Tennant playing Crowley.
I didn't know that.
Have you read Good Omens?
No.
You are going to love this show.
Yeah. I've seen the first 5 episodes of American Gods, and it is absolutely off the rails insane, and I love it.
So if more of Mr. Gaiman's books get turned into television shows and we got a Sandman, I mean, that would require some cooperation from DC.
There have been a number of failed attempts to make Sandman either a television show or a movie. At one point, Joseph Gordon-Levitt was tabbed to both produce and play... Oh, I'm blanking on his name.
Play
Morpheus.
Sleep. Right.
Yeah.
That would be pretty wild.
But I think that fell through. I don't think Joseph Gordon-Levitt's attached to it anymore. But I know that there have been a number of opportunities to make it.
So if they were to make such a thing, would you want the Yoshitaka Amano sensibilities, artistic notes? I mean, he's got a style. It is hard to mistake Yoshitaka Amano's art for anything else. Would you want that to carry over into a animated film or a television show or a movie or whatever?
I would love to see that happen, and I'm glad you asked that question because there was one other thing I wanted to mention that I had pulled up the webpage for the other day, but totally forgot about until you just said it. 1001 Nights. Have you seen the way they did? If you YouTube right now, go and YouTube it, 1001 Nights, Yoshitaka Amano, it gives you a sense of what his artwork in motion, in storytelling would look like. Now, it's not standard storytelling. I don't think there's any spoken dialogue, so it's really weird and you have to do a lot of the work yourself, but it's another thing, and it's like loosely it's based on the stories that like Aladdin and all that stuff is based on, obviously, with the 1001 Nights, for anyone who didn't know. But
Shahrazad.
I think it's about a 20-minute long video, and yeah, I mean, you'd have to tone it down a little bit. You couldn't watch that for an hour and a half. Your brain might melt and fall out your nose holes. But yeah, I could look at Yoshitaka Amano's art for 90 minutes if put properly with a story with modern sensibilities in that way. I think that would be really, really cool to see him, or even if it wasn't him directly doing it, someone adapting but using his original sketches and his style. Oftentimes very featureless people, but with stark clothing and elaborate settings. Typically they're the world they're in and the clothes they're wearing and maybe their hair is the most interesting thing about them. A lot of times the characters tend to be not clearly gendered. It's funny that I think Tetsuya Nomura would oftentimes later on be criticized heavily for having androgynous characters, but when you look at the sketches, and I have in front of me the complete works of Yoshitaka Amano from 86 to 2001, and for the stuff who I don't know who the characters are, it's very difficult to tell what gender they're supposed to be, and a lot of times it seems pretty clear that it doesn't matter. There are a lot of sketches in here with characters that have no arms, that they're missing certain features. There's a lot of the specific details of a face are less important than the action of the scene. There's always something happening. His characters are almost always doing something. He's a magnificent artist. He really is.
And if anybody listening knows who had to take this amazing art and make pixelated characters out of it, please let us know so we can give that a shout out. Because, yeah. I mean, if you look at the Warrior of Light, and in more modern versions, like in Dissidia, the Warrior of Light looks like Yoshitaka Amano's sketch, more or less.
Right.
But the fighter doesn't really. Like, there are, especially the monsters and chaos and the enemies, they look much more like Yoshitaka Amano's art. But the heroes, kind of, sort of, not so much. Like, I can't imagine there was any way to take something so amazingly beautiful and I don't even know what the word is. Make it smaller, make it fit, make it something.
Make it presentable on the technology that was available. And a lot of times that might feel like butchering it in some ways. I would imagine it would almost have to. They're just, the sketches are so gorgeous, and as sometimes pleasing as pixel art can be, I think one of the things that I actually wrote down here under that, the difficulty of going back and, sometimes trying to sell people on the old games or whatever, but there are moments of beautiful pixel art, and it reminds me of stuff like, which, by the way, I've still not seen Lego Movie.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I know.
Goodness gracious. You'll like it. You should watch it.
And my understanding is that there's a consensus that it's actually quite beautiful to behold, despite the fact that it's in many ways retro and, limited.
And they make good use of their limitations in that. That's another reason you will like that.
Right. And Jack White has a whole musical theory about how limitations are important. And, so I think you're right that absolutely credit goes to the digital pixel artist who had to take Amano's sketches and turn them into something. I think interestingly, too, is that one of his most famous sketches, probably of the two from this first game, pictures Chaos, the final villain of the game, gigantic, taking up 2/3 of the sketch, facing the viewer with his hand out and like sand, I think, or pouring through his hand, and he's enormous.
It's a beautiful piece.
It's really gorgeous, and in front of him, very small. In fact, you could miss that they're even there. You could stand there and look at that thing for a good 10 minutes and not realize that tiny, tiny, tiny in the foreground are 4 warriors of light, and that's actually something that's mirrored in the pixel art and would be for most of the game. Something that's really interesting is that when you go into battle, the main characters look very basic. The monsters are what's drawn elaborately and really creatively. They get the most of the attention.
And oftentimes that last fight against whatever the last monster or boss is, they are towering figures, sometimes quite literally.
Nice. I like that. I also wanted to mention the other main piece being the sketch of Garland, which I think later on they would get in the habit of putting an image behind the Final Fantasy logo, and they would choose this sketch of Garland. It wasn't a tradition yet, but later they would put it there. So again, the two most famous images, his two most important, well-known sketches from the first game that would really help launch his career, though he already had a little bit of one, are of the villains, not of the heroes, of Garland and Chaos.
If we could talk a bit about the pixelated art, especially the Warriors of Light, there are a couple things I would like to mention. Well, mostly I want to talk about the mages. But to talk about the other guys first, the fighter, even though that would change over time, that's still, that sort of spiky hair that he's got, that's almost an anime staple. That's one of the things that would remain, and I think he's one of those indelible images. I think the thief and the black belt get overlooked a lot. They're not the most inspiring images, I don't think. In fact, the black belt, when redone in Dawn of Souls, they make him look much more like the monk from Final Fantasy Tactics, and they renamed him Monk, so that makes sense. The thing I wanted to mention about the thief is that a lot of people I talked to about Final Fantasy, when I was first getting into it at the time, they thought that the thief was an elf because his ears looked vaguely pointed. I never thought he was, but a lot of people I have talked to about it have thought so also. I don't know if that's a widespread belief. But when the remake comes, when the thief takes on the characteristics that would become more standard to thieves in Final Fantasy, he's got that green bandana on, and therefore we can't see his ears. So, I don't know. Maybe there's some elfishness. Yeah. The most famous, though, I think, are the mages. Red Mage, Black Mage, and White Mage.
Talk about knocking it out of the park with three character designs for 3 characters that have no character.
Right. And they maintain to this day. And if you look at a Black Mage, that's what a Black Mage looks like. Though, it should be noted that when in the original game, when you get your character upgrades, the Black Mage takes his hat off and throws his hood back and doesn't look like a Final Fantasy Black Mage anymore. But in the remakes, they kept that, or they maintained what is now the classic Black Mage look.
Yeah. I was at that concert, whatever, a week or so ago, and there's a guy dressed as Squall, some of that.
Yeah.
But there's a White Mage. There's always a White Mage. There's always a Black Mage. Always. And Red Mage is a little less common, but and polls have shown this is one of the most popular, always has been. In fact, I think one of the most telling things about Amano himself being particularly happy with that design is that it shows up again in Vampire Hunter D. It's one of his favorites, the Red Mage in Vampire Hunter D. Again, very French. That hat.
And I gotta say,
no.
As you and I mentioned, and we've mentioned this before, I think, and we'll mention it again, I tend not to choose favorites. I tend to try to look at things as a whole, and I try to understand it within context of itself. If you were to ask me, for example, what my favorite Star Wars movie is, I don't have an answer. I tend to look at it as a single narrative with many fantastic elements and moments, and a few that perhaps fall a bit short. So, I don't really have a favorite Final Fantasy. I don't really have a favorite character, except maybe I do a bit here and there. I am very partial to the Red Mage. I like the versatility. I like the outfit. It might be my favorite class, and a lot of that has to do with the character design.
Yeah. I don't know if it's my favorite character class, but as I mentioned earlier, I have always been partial to Black Mage. I remember when I played the original Final Fantasy, I thought that Black Mage, the design made it very possible that the character be a woman as well. The fact that, again, is a nice ode to Amano's original sketches of even regular people who oftentimes have indistinguishable faces. Black Mage literally has no face. And, of course, it would be 9 games later, well, I guess 8 games later, if we're doing our math correct. If we're being snooty about our math. Vivi is one of the best characters in the history of the franchise, and is that same character design from all those years before. It's pretty remarkable what he was able to do with that image, because I think I'm with you. I love the way Red Mage is designed, and you see White Mage in a lot of places. I think some people might even say that White Mage is more indelible than Black Mage, but I think Black Mage is maybe in the top 5 images. You think of Final Fantasy, there's crystals, there's Moogles, there's chocobos, airships, there's Black Mage. I think that's a whole podcast.
Black Mage, White Mage,
yeah.
I think you're right. That's pretty strong. The 3 mages, I think, are the ones that really knock it out of the park. And
right in the first game.
My goodness. Setting the bar a little high there, aren't you guys? Come on.
Right.
Leave some for the rest of us.
No wonder this thing saved a company. If it really did, if that's really the story. Or certainly we know that they went from being just some company to being Squaresoft, pretty much as this happened. This was a huge success, and these are the reasons why, despite some of the things we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, with some of the gameplay being anywhere from counterintuitive to downright frustrating, just certain things about it that don't work as well. It ends with this, some people might call it a Deus Ex Machina. I don't think that it is, but it's still this crazy idea that seemingly comes out of left field with the 2,000-year time loop. But it was also clearly, and this is something I harp on whenever I do kind of review things, when I talk about when I did my list of the best comic book adaptations, the reason I went with Daredevil is because I think it's so expertly crafted. You can tell that a great deal of care went into making each individual part of it, and that's what we see here with this artwork, with the music, with the combination of these things together. Like, man, these guys were inspired when they created this.
So how do you want to examine this first Final Fantasy game as a work of art?
Well, that's a big question.
That's why I asked you.
I think what I would like to try to do, and I think it'll be fun that part of this will be a little back and forth between us.
Aha!
Something we might not always agree on, since we're going to always agree on liking these games.
Right.
I think I have set out 11 things. Really, it's a top 10, but there's an 11th.
What is it with you and lists?
Yeah, it's how I roll. 11 things that I really try to avoid when I review something, which I occasionally have done, and really more things I wish people wouldn't do whenever I'm reading a review of something.
These are the 11 things not to do, according to Mr. Drew Kreisman.
Right. And then after that, we'll talk about the 5 things we're going to try to focus on. But first, let's talk about the 11 things we're not going to do, all right? Everyone got that? 11, then 5.
So 2 lists.
Yeah.
Excellent.
No one said there was going to be math, right? Let's start with my bonus thing not to do, because it's not a hard and fast rule, but number 11 on the list, avoid hasty assumptions or reviews of other things. Ironically, someplace I see this a lot is when a Final Fantasy movie comes out. You like Advent Children, so you start your Advent Children review by saying, well, everybody knows the Spirits Within sucked, and this is better than that.
Right.
That's a poor way to review something, because you're assuming everybody agrees with your review of something else.
Right. And it is important when you're reviewing something to take it in the context of its history. And so if you're going to review Advent Children, you should talk about Spirits Within. But to assume hastily that everyone agrees that thing X sucks is inappropriate.
Right. So that's why I did have the word hastily in there, and why it's a bonus one. It's like you can take the time to put it into proper context, and you probably should, and we'll get into that. So our list proper starts here with number 10. Recognize the difference between subjective and objective. This is something I think we're going to have a lot of back and forth on. This is at the crux of a lot of problems in trying to review things, but something I hear a lot of people say is, well, art or music, or whether you like a video game or not, is entirely subjective. To which I say, that's nonsense. And the reason I know that is because I'm a musician that used to be a really bad musician, and I got better.
Well, certainly I can agree with you that one can get better at playing music or writing or reviewing video games, but
Right.
But somebody who has worked on and perhaps mastered their craft, you can't necessarily say that their end piece is objectively better than somebody else's end piece or opus or whatever you like. There's some differences between being subjective and objective about how one can review a thing, and whether or not a thing is subjectively or objectively good or better, but sometimes it's a false comparison. Sometimes it's the apples and oranges argument.
Right. And I think, the misapplication of it is where this often gets a bad rap from people who prefer that everything be subjective. But in video games especially, like, you can point out, for example, if there's a game mechanic that doesn't work, if a game glitches,
Right.
if that's like the equivalent of a singer missing a note, that's an objective thing that, like, you didn't play a note outside of the scale on purpose for effect.
Right.
You messed up.
Which I don't think we're going to get much into in this series of podcastian episodes, are we?
Probably not. Where you might find it, no, I like podcastian episodes.
We're keeping that?
Yes.
Okay.
Where you might find it, though, at least where there are some arguments out there, is in plot holes. Plot holes are objective. It either works or it doesn't work. It's not a subjective thing. Now, there are some things where it's ambiguous, so you can't say conclusively, like the 2,000-year time loop, like we talked about, it doesn't work. But those are the things where you've got to recognize, yes, this is a matter of subjectivity, versus certain things where it really isn't. If you're going to claim that this has a plot hole, you have a burden of proof to objectively show that it does not work.
That's fair.
Number 9, take a moment to compartmentalize. I think this is, again, it kind of goes hand in hand with what we were just talking about. My favorite example of this most recently was when Suicide Squad walked away with an Academy Award for Best Makeup. And a bunch of people made jokes about how Suicide Squad has one more Academy Award than Citizen Kane. But the makeup artists are not the people that made the plot of that movie dumb.
Right. The makeup artists absolutely should be recognized for that movie. And I think this is where we get into, for this series, when we're talking about graphics, for example. I don't think we can hold the graphics of Final Fantasy VII to the same standard that we hold the graphics of Final Fantasy 15. On the other hand, I'm not sure we're going to talk a whole lot about graphics in this series.
To some degree.
I guess when we get into the artwork and such.
Yeah. Where another thing where I think it will come into play in this series that I wrote here as part of this is there may be one massive flaw in the game, or something that, if it's not even objectively a flaw, subjectively something you really don't like. I can think of specifically in 10 and 13. They're linear. Hallways. You may not like that. But if you're going to try to objectively review something, you have to compartmentalize and not just say, well, this entire thing is bad because it has a feature that I really don't like.
Right.
Like, that has nothing to do with, again, the music, the artwork, the storytelling, the characters, what the central themes were.
But you can't say subjectively, I don't like that game because of that one thing I don't like.
Exactly.
Right.
And those are just two different comments to be made. That's kind of the difference between subjective and objective. Might otherwise be said the difference between saying something is good versus something is my favorite.
All right, smart guy, listen here.
We'll keep having that debate. In fact, the number 8, be open to debate.
Love to debate.
Which means that it actually is possible to be wrong about how you've interpreted a piece of art.
Yeah. One of my favorite things is to have somebody point out something to me in a book or a game or a movie that I didn't realize, that I perhaps misinterpreted, and be open to reinterpreting the whole thing, be open to understanding it in a new way and perhaps appreciating a thing that before I thought was uninteresting or no good.
For example, something from Final Fantasy that I was convinced, like most people, the first time I saw the laughing scene in Final Fantasy X, I thought it was absurd, silly, stupid, all of this. I eventually had someone put it to me in such a way that I came to understand it was supposed to be awkward, and then challenge me. Have you ever tried to make yourself laugh?
Who put it to you that way?
I think it was you.
Gosh, I sure hope so, because I love that scene.
And it made sense to me after that, and once I learned number 7, understand the history. Once I came to realize the voice actor has all these awards in the world. Yeah.
Do you know his name off the top of your head?
I don't. We will be mentioning him a number of times.
Yeah.
But, you recognize, it was a choice that was made.
Right.
And you may think it's silly, but when you understand the history, and of course this is more important for, like you were talking about, the context of the game, and understanding that all of these things are kind of working off of each other. As Picasso famously put it once, good artists borrow, great artists steal outright.
Is that a Picasso?
That's Picasso, yeah. Or it's often attributed to. I think that's maybe falsely attributed to. I don't know, but I've always heard it attributed to Picasso.
I thought it was a writer thing.
Yeah.
It's a truism of art. Yeah.
It's a thing people say. So yeah, one place I think this comes up a lot, which oftentimes gets mixed up, is when people are badgering. Like I had somebody get on me once for liking Supergirl because they thought that the existence of Supergirl, the television show, was coming out of the fact that comic book stuff was just really popular right now. And I had to explain to him that Supergirl is a character who's existed since the 60s.
Right. And the show may well have come out of that. Well, comic book stuff is popular right now. That's also because it's a lot of fun and pretty good right now. So it's possible to understand it as something good in the context of Supergirl as a character, and also in the context of our social appreciation for nerd stuff right now.
Right. But I think a lot of nerd stuff gets undercut by people who want to review it without ever making an honest attempt to understand the history or the culture behind it. So I don't think anyone listening to this is going to have that problem, but still, Number 6. Everything has tropes. Put them in context. Tropes are not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. They're certainly not inherently negative. As a person who tries to teach English to high school students,
tries.
Well, less so since I became a librarian, but still, every once in a while the subject does come up. Tropes are simply a way of understanding certain things that happen over and over again in various forms of literature. They are not an inherently negative thing. They're just a way to understand the sort of things we like to read, write, listen to, play, and so on.
Excellent. Number 5. Accept the premise.
I love this one.
This is something a lot of people really struggle with, especially if they, again, in the nerd culture, they find a premise to be inherently counterintuitive, silly.
If I recall correctly, after watching Benjamin Button, a movie I liked, even though a lot of people thought it was boring, and it is a bit, I get that, but there was a famous movie reviewer who may well have been Mr. Ebert, who was saying something along the lines of he just could not accept the premise. It just seemed wrong to him. He just could not get behind the premise of the movie. And that's fine if you don't like a movie because of the premise. But to assume the movie was poorly done because you didn't like the premise or didn't get the premise or couldn't get on board, that's a personal issue, not an issue with the movie or the game itself.
Right. And I think another extension of this is that as long as a thing follows its own rules. So
Sure.
I've heard a lot of people critique Star Wars because the Force is somehow this catch-all. Or I actually heard somebody say of the Final Fantasy series inaccurately, and I'm not going to call the person out, the YouTuber that gets way more listens than this podcast. but claim that Final Fantasy often uses memory loss and dreams as deus ex machina to solve plot holes. And that is incorrect. They often use having amnesia as a part of their plot,
Right.
but it's not to solve problems. It's almost always to create them.
Right. It's definitely a strong theme that comes back again and again. And it's done purposefully, not as a way to get out of a hole they might have dug themselves into. So yeah, you got to accept, or at least try to understand it from its own terms.
Right. Number 4, very important. We've touched on this a little bit. Cynicism is not criticism. And in addition to that, it kills creative thought. You cannot watch or play or listen to something for the first time ever again. And if your approach to that thing the first time is, I'm only half paying attention to this, or I think it's stupid, or I'm not trying to get it, I'm looking for things about it I don't like, I'm trying to tear it apart. I understand that a lot of time criticism and tearing things apart seem like they're the same thing, but they're not. You go back on a second or third playthrough and you find the things that don't work, or that are actual plot holes. But when you approach something for the first time, I find this happens to a lot of people, you never go looking for the parts of the movie or the show or the music or the game that are really good and really quality, because you're just not looking for it. Happens in sports all the time. People just don't go looking for the information.
One of the things about this one, I do feel like I can't watch something again for the first time, but I do feel like I can re-experience it with fresh eyes. And I think one of the reasons I can do that is because of number 8, being open to debate. If I have somebody tell me, no, you totally misunderstood that Shania Twain song that you hate,
Sure.
then I can re-listen to it. And again, I'm not listening to it for the first time, but I can try to appreciate it, or try to reappreciate it, which is similar to what you're saying here.
Yeah, I think that can be done, but for the most part, it's just tough to go back and remake that first impression. But you're right, it's worth, I think, trying to do that. You're right, that's a worthy endeavor. Number 3, as we've talked about, we've had this conversation.
I won.
Plot is king.
Yes.
But only if you're talking about a king on a chessboard.
Right.
I think the thing that gets me about this conversation the most is that people often think if they can accurately show you the line of a plot, and either that it works from beginning to end or that it doesn't, that they've said all that there needs to be said about a book or a movie or a game or whatever.
Right. That's a book report. It's not an analysis. And we are not looking for just book reports here. We're not just looking for you to tell us what happened, event A, event B, event C. We're looking for something a little more interesting than that. So I do agree with you on this. Plot is only king insofar as you've got to have a solid one. It's got to be standing for everything else to work.
Number 2, this is very important. People, really tenured reviewers, widely read national people mess this up constantly. I saw it recently a lot with Blade Runner. A depiction of a thing is not an endorsement of a thing.
Yeah.
Tyler Durden is not the hero of Fight Club.
No, that is a cautionary tale. It is also worth mentioning, though, that just because a movie depicts a thing doesn't mean that they necessarily critique the thing either. So a character might be a sexist creep on a TV show, and the TV show might not do a very good job of critiquing that person's behavior or presenting it in a way for it to be critiqued. In fact, sometimes they will present bad behavior as valorized or lionized. So sometimes depiction of the thing, while not endorsement of the thing, also isn't criticism of the thing.
Right. Sometimes a thing is just there because they think, the author thinks it fits into the story. There are all kinds of reasons, but yeah, people put a lot of extra meaning sometimes into whether or not. I think probably one of the best examples, like Ed Norton playing Supreme Racist in American History X, right?
Sure.
Like, clearly he doesn't think or feel that way, and sometimes people get so caught up in, especially if it is kind of the hero of the story,
right,
saying certain things, but no, we've got to be able to. One I saw in Final Fantasy was somebody claiming that Final Fantasy is clearly anti-religion because it's common for them to have the corruption of religion be a part of their villainous enterprises.
Sure. Right.
But like you were kind of saying, those just happen to be these particular villains in this particular way. That I think there are some critiques of religion to be had, and we're going to do a podcast on that.
Well, and especially of organized religion, not necessarily of spiritualism, as I think Ares very strongly proves.
Correct. So I think, again, you've got to be really careful about just saying, well, the bad guys typically are religious, so Final Fantasy's anti-religion. Like, no.
Yeah, not so much.
And number one, and again, this is the thing I see missed most often when people review stuff. It's so bad, but not getting what you expected or wanted is not the same thing as a product being bad or it not being good art.
Yeah, I think this is especially important. Expecting a movie to be one thing and having it be another, or expecting a game to be one way and having it be something else, doesn't mean that it was bad. You got to take on its. You have to take it on its own terms, much like accepting a premise.
Possibly my second favorite video game franchise, Metal Gear Solid, has this problem with its second game, which is my favorite in the franchise. And you will regularly hear people say, "Yeah, it was great. Yeah, it was really good." But no one wanted a game where we played as Raiden the whole time. We wanted to play as Snake because he's awesome and Raiden's a whiner. And it's like, I loved that I got something completely unexpected because I've been playing Final Fantasy my whole life. And so I was ready for a sequel that was different and challenged the rules. And so I think that's probably the most commonly used phrase that I see in reviews of stuff, where people will say, nobody wanted this.
Sure.
That's nonsense.
Right.
Also irrelevant.
One of I think related to that is sometimes people will say about a movie or a game, it was trying to be. And that always feels to me like the reviewer, or it often feels to me like the reviewer is saying, this is what I thought it was going to be, and therefore, when it wasn't, I was disappointed. And I actually ran into this recently. I watched a movie, a Studio Ghibli movie, who we have mentioned and or will mention in the future. It's called When Marnie Was There, and it's a beautiful movie, as Studio Ghibli movies are, but the trailer really presents it as it's going to be this kind of movie, and then it sort of is for the first half hour, and then it takes this turn and it's something else. And I'm coming to terms with it. I'm conflicted on the movie. I won't get into a review of it, obviously, right now, because we're doing a totally different podcast.
Different one, yeah.
But certainly that was one where I was expecting a thing, and it was only kind of that thing, and I am disappointed, and I'm trying to figure out how I feel about it.
And in this universe, I think something where we've seen a large group of people do this, I've noticed this as I've been doing research for the podcast, is Final Fantasy XII, which when it first came out, there was a lot of backlash against. I mean, it's not directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi.
Right.
The music isn't by Nobuo Uematsu.
Right.
It takes place back in the Evil East, so it's more related to Vagrant's story and Final Fantasy Tactics than it is in some ways the Numbered. There are a lot of things people didn't like about that. It plays like an open world game, which is where now the industry is just gone.
Oh man, Final Fantasy open world.
You look back on it now, it was so ahead of its time, but it's the game that I have seen the most where there were negative reviews of it when it first came out, and people have completely swapped to the point where Watch Mojo had it listed as their number 2 Final Fantasy game, their favorite.
Really?
Yeah, and I know a lot of people have it now, and it's not in my top 4 or 5. That's a conversation for a whole other time.
Yeah, I've seen that list.
We'll get there, but I think after years of people taking a look at it and realizing that just because it wasn't what they wanted didn't mean it wasn't really, really good, because it was. And I think people just took the time, and it took a little getting over what you needed it to be. Maybe one day enough people will see Final Fantasy The Spirits Within.
Man, I think we're on a losing battle on that one.
Maybe.
All right, so those are the things we're going to try to do and or not do. Our list of 11 things, our list of 11 rules that we follow when we're trying to critique or analyze something. But that was only sort of the question. The question was, Drew.
Yeah, that was a nice little side.
How are we going to try to analyze this game as a piece of art?
So I think a good way to try to do it is separate it into 5 really broad categories here.
I love me some really broad categories.
One, we're going to talk about impact on society and culture. Now, this is kind of how I prioritize whenever I evaluate art, but I think most times you're gonna see these things, just maybe not in this order. So I put impact on society and culture first. This is how timeless is it? This is, does it make a comment on our society, on the way we live our lives? Does it have something to say that would be meaningful, that it's possible for a person to walk away from that piece of art saying, that impacted my life. That made me think about who I am, who I want to be, what kind of world I want to live in. I think that's the most important thing you can do to become a great piece of art. Number 2, your impact on the industry. Did you break rules? Did you establish new norms? The Beatles are famous for, getting a ton of points for doing this, impact on the industry. A lot of times when you see best video games of all time, you'll see Tetris and Pong and Super Mario in the top couple spots.
Because they broke it open.
Right. Number 3, this is where a lot of the subjectivity we're talking about earlier, subjectivity versus objectivity, this is far more subjective. How well crafted is it? In each of its individual parts, as we've been talking about on this podcast. The art, the music, the gameplay, everything that comes together, how well crafted is it? Originality, composition, functionality. We're talking about, does it have flaws?
Right.
Aesthetically appealing, that's really subjective when you start getting into aesthetic appeal. And then the quality of the first thing we talked about, the societal impact. It's one thing to have something to say. It's another thing to do so in an incredibly evocative way. The fourth thing is part objective and part completely subjective, which is impact on individuals.
Right.
Impact on individuals can be measured in a completely objective way through sales.
Sure.
In pretty much any, movies, music, works for everybody.
Right. How much money did they make off it?
And then the other thing, which we see a lot with the Final Fantasy universe especially, is just the impact you see on individuals and how much they make it a part of their lives.
Right. As we've already talked about here with all those fan arrangements of Nobuo Uematsu's music, you can also see that in fan art. You can see it in, there's an RPG maker in which people try to make and remake various Final Fantasy games or variations thereof. You can see it on cosplay.
Fan fiction.
Fan fiction, absolutely.
So there's a ton of it for that. And then fifth, and it's the thing I think people oftentimes get a little too carried away with, because I think it's the easiest one typically to spot.
Sure.
Flaws. Does this thing have glaring flaws? And I think another nerdy thing that I'll put this conversation in context of, and kind of wrapping up our 11 and our 5 here, was I think a good litmus test for this is I think that the third Chris Nolan Batman movie is better than the first Chris Nolan Batman movie.
Oh, boy.
The first, Batman Begins.
Yeah, I know that one.
Has a plot with few flaws.
Right.
That works really well.
Yes.
But to me, thematically, is less interesting, has less of that, number one, impact on society and culture. What I really like about Dark Knight Rises, while conceding it has way more flaws, because there are some things, plot hole, the autopilot thing doesn't make any sense.
Right. The magical knee brace?
Yeah, doesn't make any sense. The back broken thing. There's a lot of stuff in that movie that does not work.
Okay.
It is a more flawed film. But what it has to say about the culture war between the rich and the poor and turning Batman's wealth into a potential villainous aspect of his character, I thought was far more interesting and timely of a comment on where we were, especially like the scenes where Bane is going into stock exchanges and talking about how you steal money from people.
Right.
To me, is far more interesting than anything that happens in Batman Begins.
Well, I would fight you on that, but this is not a Batman podcast.
Correct. That was just my... Anyway, yeah, that was just an example. You may agree or disagree, and I think what you would say then was that you might put flaws higher on your priority list, where flaws are number 5 on my list. If I can... Some flaws won't throw me off unless they're absolutely, just, as we've talked about, just derail your thing entirely.
Right. That's fair.
But...
All
so,
right.
For the most part, we're going to do that with Final Fantasy 1.
All right, so, Drew,
Yeah.
we have talked about the story. We've talked about gameplay. We've talked about music. We've talked about artwork. How would you say then, I'm not going to ask you to rate it because I think we said we're not going to do that, but how would you If you want to talk about video games as an artistic medium, how can we use that lens to understand Final Fantasy as a whole? The first game, Final Fantasy 1.
Yeah. Well, traditional logic would tell you that you start with, like if I'm applying the other world I'm most familiar with, where you do these kinds of exercises, which is music, you talk about impact on the industry, and actually when you talk about impact on the industry, what you're really talking about is a manifestation of what rules did you break, or what new things did you introduce? Because that's how you impact the industry. If you make something that's exceptionally well crafted, but you didn't have any new ideas of yourself, you're I don't know, in sync or something. Well done, put together. You guys can sing and dance good, but
are you picking on those boys again?
I would never.
Is that going to be a whole nother podcast episode?
Yes. But the reason bands like the Beatles are remembered as well as they are, the reason they're talked about when people are objectively trying to measure music, is because they introduced so many ideas that previously had not been implemented in music that had reached any kind of wide audiences, and it's stuff we would see repeated by people throughout the years ever since. And I think that's where you have to start with Final Fantasy 1 as a piece of artwork. It might be the second most important piece of artwork in the franchise in that particular measuring tool of impact on the industry, because it really set the stage for how you make a successful role-playing game. There's before Final Fantasy and after Final Fantasy, the same way there is kind of before the Beatles and after the Beatles. I would say number one on that list is probably Final Fantasy VII. Hate it, love it, whatever you may feel about it, that game had, I think, more impact on the industry and more bending of the rules than even the first game did, because where Final Fantasy 1 is built on the predecessors of things that we've talked about, Dungeons and Dragons, Lord of the Rings, Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy 7 has taken the things that they kind of set up themselves, they've established their own thing, and then they start bending and breaking their own rules. And it's just rare in artistic history that you see people get to do something like that. But there may be other games you might say they actually had a bigger impact, but Final Fantasy 1 changed the course of video games and digital storytelling.
One of the other things we tend to talk about when we talk about whether or not a piece of art, a work of art is good art or worthy of discussion, is the cultural impact. You might think of this as its popularity, whether or not the thing was popular, but it's also about timelessness. For example, we talk about Shakespeare as one of the greatest English writers of all time, and that's because not only is his work popular, a lot of people like it, but it's also timeless. It is done again. It is retold. It is retold in... Not only is it staged countless times per year, but it is also told in a different way. For example, West Side Story is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet. 10 Things I Hate About You is a retelling of Taming of the Shrew. The Lion King is a retelling of Hamlet with a little bit of Henry V in there. Or Henry IV, excuse me. So in any case, Final Fantasy has been redone. Not only in its own remakes, but it has had other games that have tried to be a Final Fantasy-like game, or to take Final Fantasy's successes and improve on them in some ways. And some games have, and some games, I think, missed the mark. But as a work of art, as the video game medium we talked about earlier, combining story and visual arts and musical arts, and then this gameplay, this mechanic that allows you to, in some ways, control how the art is experienced and understood. Final Fantasy, not only because it launches this massive franchise, but because of what it does itself, is an impact on the culture. And you can see it in the concerts. You can see it in the fan art, in people who have who have remixed the music, who cosplay it. There is an impact on the culture, and that is at least as important, I think, as the impact on the industry.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's probably more important even. I think there is a huge impact on the culture. When Final Fantasy 15 was coming out, I mentioned Xavier Woods earlier. He's part of a video that they did with a bunch of people just talking about what the franchise has meant to them over the years. There were a lot of people, a lot of couples who got together playing Final Fantasy 8. That was a common thread. There are a lot of people that have Final Fantasy music played at their weddings. There are people that have, that dress up as the characters at their weddings or at big events, or certainly at events where you're supposed to do those kinds of things. No, you're not supposed to at weddings, but I mean, where the whole point that everyone is there to do, cosplay or video game conventions, whatever it may be. I'm sometimes addicted to those top 10 lists that you can find all over YouTube, Watch Mojo, What Culture, any of those ones. I'll get into watching top 10 lists. And it's not uncommon to see this. Top 10 RPGs not in the Final Fantasy franchise.
Yeah.
Because if you did the top 10 RPGs of all time, if you're trying to legitimately be objective, or I've seen top 10 stories in video games non-Squaresoft or non-Square Enix, because if you include them, they're going to take up at least half your list. I've seen that with music as well. Top 10 video game compositions, we're not including Nobuo Uematsu in this. He can have his own, and then he'll have his own list, which I don't understand how anyone...
And probably Koji Kondo also, because that's not quite fair.
Koji Kondo could absolutely have his own list. But, and I think that's also true for people outside of, like you were saying, just the impact of the industry, just for people who it's impacted their lives. Like, I really like lots of different kinds of video games, and I think there are lots of different kinds of video game stories that are really interesting. Some of them creep up on some of the level, but there just isn't anything that with anywhere near this kind of consistency has me thinking about it, feeling about it, wanting to just stay inside of it. And that's the reason why there are so many of them, and they sell so many copies whenever they come out. And I believe it was the famous, or perhaps infamous, movie critic Roger Ebert who said that he would believe a video game is a piece of art, is a legitimate art form, when somebody says they cried while playing a video game. And when you look at any polls, any question, if you crowdsource information from video game fans, what was the first video game that made you cry? The overwhelming favorite is Final Fantasy VII, and we all know the moment. It's always number one on that list. For people, I mean, if you're old enough to have played it when it first came out, especially, that might start to go down as, younger people come up and the first game they played that made them cry was something that's new. But for people who were playing games at the time, and I think largely for the industry, that was the first time that maybe even video game technology was in a place where they were capable of doing it. There are a lot of ways you could look at it, but the long and short of it is that... But I don't think that's a completely unfair way to try to very broadly categorize art, that it at least have the ability to touch you and move you on that level. And I think that while the Final Fantasy franchise may have reached that before 7...
I think it did. And I think we can talk about some of that when we get there.
I think it is the franchise that succeeds on that level more than any other game in the medium, and does so as well as maybe any other franchise in film, television, video game, or comic book that I can think of. And I'm relatively well versed in those things. Thanks for listening. That's it for this episode. Feel free to let us know what we missed, got wrong, or should have mentioned. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at FFWeeklyPod, or you can email us at finalfantasyweekly@gmail.com. Join us next time when we analyze Rebels, Imperials, and the motifs that divide us.